Oh my god, hello, and welcome to part 3 of my bumper list, my list of 162 Soulsborne bosses. We've covered so much already in parts 1 and 2, travelling from the Bed of Chaos at rank 162 all the way to Great Grey Wolf Sith at rank 41, but now we're talking about the absolute best bosses that Soulsborne has to offer, which means the best bosses that video games as a whole have to offer. I hope you're as excited as I am to get stuck right in. If you haven't seen parts 1 or 2 of this series, I would advise you to check those out, but if you just want to skip straight to part 3 here to see what my picks were for the best of the best, that's all good too. Before getting stuck straight in with number 40, please allow me to give a fond thank you to my kind patrons for their support. And with all that being said, let's just begin. I would say that the Nameless King is pretty much the most difficult encounter in Dark Souls 3's base game. There are strong contenders like Pontiff Solvan and maybe the Soul of Cinder, but to me the Nameless King retains his crown, though if we're taking the DLCs into consideration, I do consider Sister Frieda to be even harder still. Like many brutal bosses, it comes in 2 phases, with each phase feeling very different. The first phase is against the king who flies around this stormy arena from on top of a feathered wyvern, throwing out lightning spears from overhead and slamming down onto the ground with his enormous weapon, though the wyvern itself also plays a major role in offense, being capable of breathing fire. It's one of those phases that I just flat out resented at first, wishing it wasn't even there and that I could just move straight onto the more difficult second phase, especially when I'd find myself having to chase the wyvern around the arena. But like any good precursor to a much harder boss, you really can get to the point where the first phase pretty much stops being much of an issue, though admittedly, if you really find yourself struggling on that second phase, the inclusion of the first can cause extra unwanted fatigue. It is that second phase in particular that causes all the issues though, because to put it simply, the Nameless King is one tough customer. He has a ton of attacks, both ranged and melee, many of which do extra lightning damage, and because of the size of his spear he has excellent range too, meaning that you really have to be smart when picking your moments for healing. Speaking of healing, this fight nearly always leaves me nearly devoid of remaining Estus by the time the boss goes down, because for me, this encounter always makes for a desperate struggle, but in a way I can really get behind. The Nameless King doesn't have a single attack or combo that's even remotely bullshit. You can see everything coming and the animations are clearly and appropriately telegraphed. There's no trickery or real cause for frustration. It's just a thunderously tough boss with a brilliant moveset who is here to provide the most significant challenge found in the base game. On my first playthrough, I couldn't even beat Nameless King solo and had to resort to summoning help, which still resulted in several deaths before victory eventually came my way. I can beat him solo now of course, but he never feels easy for me, and I don't think he ever will, and I think that's how it should be with this boss. After playing through the jaw-droppingly incredible Stormvale Castle level and then making it to the hideously incredible demigod boss that is Godric the Grafted, the bar was set very high for me. Right from the start the game builds a great deal of hype and anticipation around the Shard Bearers, and Godric more than lived up to it. I was blown away by that encounter, and so when I set off for the Academy of Rhea Lucaria, I had similar expectations, hoping that although she wasn't technically a demigod, that Rinawa would make for a similarly excellent boss fight. Well, folks, while I don't rate Rinawa quite as highly as Godric, suffice to say I was not at all disappointed by this fight. In fact, I think it's also incredible. For as gimmicky as it certainly is, I even loved the first phase of the fight. To be honest, I'm getting a bit tired of calling bosses gimmicky, because it sounds kinda cheap and derogatory, but I really don't mean it that way. Anyway, by the time we meet her, Rinawa is a mere shadow of her former self, rambling away whilst endlessly birthing and then reviving her host of malformed children. It's actually pretty messed up, as are most things in Elden Ring. The strategy is of course to strike the 3 children highlighted with a golden aura, after which the amber shell which Rinawa is suspended in comes crashing down, leaving her open for damage. It's hardly a very challenging first phase, and you can deplete all the health here in just 2 or 3 cycles, but the visuals and music here are beautiful, especially with the non-stop vocal accompaniment of all the children in the room. It's done really well because their voices aren't part of the soundtrack or anything, they just complement it very effectively. The second phase is where the battle really begins, though here we're only actually fighting a spirit version of Rennala summoned by a magical snare set up by her daughter, Ranni. I somehow missed this detail entirely on my first playthrough and thought that the true Rennala had simply woken up here, but no, this is a mere projection of her as she was in her prime, as the true queen of the full moon. I earlier mentioned the balancing issues that Elden Ring has when I was talking about Morgott, but you can even encounter this issue as early as Rennala. On my first playthrough, I actually found her to be very difficult to handle. Her spells were powerful, but in particular once she starts summoning dragons, trolls and bloodhound knights, it was a real challenge, but then I hadn't really explored Liurnia all that thoroughly. If you do explore both Liurnia and Limgrave well beforehand though, then by the time you get to Rennala, she might just go down way too quickly because of how leveled up and upgraded your character is. Bear in mind that Liurnia is absolutely massive, and who knows, you might have even spent a good bit of time in Caelid before entering the academy. Difficulty and balance issues aside though, I truly was enchanted by this entire encounter, especially when I found myself in another vast moonlit lake, just like in the Rom fight from Bloodborne. The Abyss Watchers are rather unique amongst Dark Souls 3's 5 Lords of Cinder in that, unlike the others, they all collectively share as the Lords of Cinder throughout their wolf blood. This also makes the fight rather unique in that instead of being against just one mighty foe, or even two like with the Twin Princes fight, you're fighting a group of them. But yet another unique aspect is that not only are you fighting the Abyss Watchers, but they're fighting each other, even before you get there. The idea is that they're so singularly focused on destroying any entity with even the faintest taint of the Abyss that they're locked in eternal conflict with each other, with them all having gradually been corrupted by the Abyss due to their frequent contact with it, meaning that unless a certain Ashen One intervenes, they're doomed to carry on killing each other, then reviving forever in this large hall. The fight itself really isn't one of the best in the series, and nor is it really the most difficult, even when one of the Abyss Watchers absorbs the blood of its fallen soldiers, imbuing it with the power of fire for an even more dramatic second phase. But it's that damn emotional aspect that Dark Souls 3 does so incredibly well that sets this boss apart, and a major component of that is of course that wonderful, swelling soundtrack, and the way it always seems to crescendo at just the right moments. Beautiful fight with a great group of tragic and badass warriors. As far as I'm aware, unless I'm forgetting something, I believe Vicar Amelia is the only example in the whole game of a woman transforming into a beast, and what a transformation. It's very artistically done too, with the way the camera shifts to a different angle where only Amelia's shadow is exposed as she changes from a human to a savage beast in mere seconds, and as sick as it would have been to actually see the transformation, American Werewolf in London style, I think this way of depicting it was way more effective, particularly with the way the blood sprays onto the nearby statue to hammer home how violent the change is. Style and cinematography aside though, Vicar Amelia also makes for a tremendous main boss, with her defeat being a requirement to learn the password to gain access to the Forbidden Woods then onto Bergenworth. She's got a ton of health and a plethora of savage attacks as she lashes out with her claws and slams her fists down on the church floor. Just like with the One Reborn and Dark Beast Parel, staggers are supremely important here so as to give you extra openings for attacks and then big follow-up damage with a critical, though unlike any other boss in the game, Amelia can actually heal herself after enough damage has been dealt with a strangely sad praying animation. I think that is an aspect of the boss that makes it stand out so well. Whilst Amelia has transformed into a crazy looking beast, there are still traces of the human vicar here with some of her animations, and the beast's white fur and clothing give it a somewhat saintly vibe. You can really feel the beast's torment too, with the way she screams during every single attack in a way that manages to sound half bestial and half feminine. I'm very glad they went on to use much the same arena for the Lawrence fight later on in the DLC too, because it makes for a perfect location to fight these horrific beasts of the church. By the time you reach Old Yharnam, you will have encountered a variety of feral beasts and strange pale men in central Yharnam, the cathedral ward, and throughout the ruins of Old Yharnam itself, but as you enter into the Church of the Good Chalice, a different sort of beast awaits, looming ominously at the far end of the church by the altar, the blood-starved beast. This creature has always been terrifying to me, because compared to all other beasts fought thus far, it's so much more foul and noxious, to the point where instead of blood splattering out each time you hit it, the arena is instead doused in sprays of some other toxic fluid, even spilling out as it darts around the arena in desperation for its next fix of blood. There's a savage urgency in its lashes and lunges, at least before it returns back to the unsettling predatory prowl before the next sickening onslaught of desperate attacks. I've already covered a couple of bosses where you take damage just by standing near to them, like Abritus and the Smelter Demons, but in the case of the blood-starved beast, you can get poisoned by staying too close after enough contact with its disgusting life fluid. It also has one of the most devious attacks in the game, where it suddenly comes to a halt before lashing out for a grab attack that has killed me every time it's ever made contact, though after getting nailed by it a few times, you do learn to watch out for it, you have to. The Blood-Starved Beast is actually an optional boss, same with the whole of Old Yharnam, and while I'm not actually the biggest fan of Old Yharnam as a level, I do consider myself to be a member of the Blood-Starved Beast fan club. There are a lot of things I adore about the battle with Sekiro's Divine Dragon, but there is also the fact that it's a bit of a gimmick battle and that you don't fight it conventionally with your sword. You've got to use a very specific strategy to defeat it. Well, if you were to look at the size and design of the fire giant without having any knowledge of how the fight actually plays out, you could be forgiven for expecting another gimmick fight, hopefully another great one. Instead though, this is a straight fight between a man or woman and a giant. There aren't really any tricks here, or special swords, or divine lightning. No, you're just fighting a titan with a titanic health bar, and it is fucking epic. Everything about it, the expansive arena, the size of the boss, the way it rolls around the arena, literally flattening trees on the way, the scale of its fire attacks, the impact and weight of its shield attacks, the powerful soundtrack, its roars of anger and pain, and then you have the phase transition where it rips its own fucking leg off. You guys know by this point how much I like it when an arm gets ripped off, but a leg? My god! I will confess though that I've never quite been a lover of the second phase when compared to the first. In the first phase you can simply attack its feet and ankles for good damage, and then even more damage as that thing falls off its ankle, but in phase 2 most of its body gets a sizable defense buff, and just staying under him gets to be way more dangerous. I have already mentioned that I did a level 1 run of the game, and by the way, that run happened to be the most difficult thing I've ever done in over 20 years of gaming, but in particular, the fire giant at level 1 was sheer hell. Taking it on with a boatload of health and crimson flasks is one thing, but when you literally can't afford to tank a single hit, it's a whole other story, and I'll never do that challenge again. I'm not exaggerating here, it must have taken about 10 fucking hours before I beat it. I guess it was kinda fun. I know there are people who really don't like this fight, but even after all the pain and suffering it has caused me in my life, I love it. Now, while coming in at number 34 is absolutely nothing to sniff at, I imagine there might be more than a few raised eyebrows at me not perhaps including Sister Frieda in the top 20 or even the top 10. Well, if I'm being perfectly honest, the main reason is the difficulty of her third phase, Black Flame Frieda. Sister Frieda is of course the only mandatory boss in the Ashes of Ariandel DLC, fought right at the end, though you can meet and speak to her much earlier if you wish. After opening the entrance to Father Ariandel's lair, however, the catalyst for the boss fight has been triggered, leading to what I consider to be the single most difficult boss in all of Dark Souls 3. There are 3 phases here, though even the first phase can be a massive headache. She does huge damage and has a bunch of tricks, one of which has her go invisible before leaping off to a different point in the arena, and it's for you to work out where she's moved to. Sometimes I can work this out, and sometimes I can't, which makes it very difficult to avoid her next attack. The second phase is significantly more explosive, with Father Ariandel joining in too, violently slamming his fire-filled vessel around the arena, bathing everything in flames, all while Frieda sends damaging streams of ice in your direction, not to mention her swift and deadly scythe combos. It's intense, but thankfully they do have a shared health pool, and so it's generally a good idea to focus fire on Father Ariandel's enormous frame here to end phase 2. It's phase 3 though that I don't think I'll ever come close to mastering, because personally I think it's a bit much. Every now and then in a Soulsborne game I'll encounter a boss that just overwhelms me, but usually I overcome that and get to the point where the boss becomes less intimidating. With Black Flame Frieda though, that moment never came. I always get overwhelmed by her insane combos of fire, ice and dark. She does so much damage, her combos are so fucking long, and it's really difficult to not get tagged by the elemental havoc she wreaks upon the arena, and I must confess, it's not really for me. I think phases 1 and 2 are both fantastic and challenging, but phase 3 goes into territory where it negatively affects my enjoyment. There are certainly a decent few bosses I really enjoy from Dark Souls 2's base game, but the DLCs introduce some special ones, especially the Crown of the Iron King, and my pick for number 33 is another optional boss from that DLC, Sir Alon. Despite FromSoft being a Japanese developer, the main aesthetic found in the Souls games is of a medieval dark fantasy persuasion, with only occasional nods to Eastern elements, though those nods are very special when they do appear. For the Sir Alon fight though, you are straight up fighting a samurai, armed with an enormous odachi and equipped with traditional samurai armour, and it is in fact Sir Alon's armour which must be touched to enter into the memory of the old Iron King. Sadly, this short level leading up to it is absolutely awful in every way. It is lousy with Alon Knights and fireball hurling flame lizards, but it also just looks like shit. Seriously, this is one of the laziest looking levels in the game. It's like they just copy pasted a bunch of wall and doorway assets together and stuck a bunch of enemies inside it, and that's a real shame. It would have been way better if you just got warped directly inside the boss fight here, because despite how poor the level is, the boss is one of the best in the game. You do encounter echoes of Sir Alon's fighting style earlier in the Iron Keep of course, with the Alon Knights and Captains, but the real deal is significantly more impressive, graceful and formidable. He can be very tough at first due to how distinctive his attack animations are, often getting into position and then suddenly striking it with his enormous blade, and this is likely to take at least a few attempts before you get a hang of the timing. Even so, this ultimately is an honest battle between two swordsmen, and it's just a case of learning his combos, jump attacks, and in particular his cursed thrust attack, draining some health and buffing him for a period afterwards in a very similar manner as the cursed thrust of the Pursuer. It's not just the fight that's great though, this is one of the best looking boss arenas in the series. You're not in some expansive outdoor area or in a blue moonlit lake, you're just in a small hall with one of the most reflective floors I have ever seen. The surface has been buffed to perfection. Now, I know a lot of people don't really like this boss, and I'm well aware of the main reasons why from seeing so many folk complain about it back when the game first came out. It's the Demon of Hatred, found in the same arena where you earlier fought Gyobu Onewa after the Interior Ministry invades Ashina. The main reason I kept hearing for why people disliked or even hated the Demon of Hatred was that the game's been teaching you to deflect everything the whole way through the game, and then all of a sudden you get to this monster and that goes out the window. Now it's more about dodging its attacks than deflecting, attacks like its stomps and fireballs and all the other weird shit it does. Plus, this fight is less about building posture and more about simply depleting its health, hence there being less of an emphasis on deflecting. And speaking of its health, let's not disregard the fact that it's one of the very few enemies in the game with 3 whole health bars to deplete, with each one of those health bars consisting of a fuckload of health. Well, I heard these points and criticisms, but to be honest, none of them really resonated with me. Who gives a fuck if the game requires a different strategy from you for one of its bosses? Just adapt. I never understood why people found it so outrageous that the game threw something a bit different at you. The Blazing Bull and Guardian Ape fights also promote the use of dodges and smart spacing over deflecting. People were also saying, the game basically just throws a Bloodborne at you, to which I thought, fine by me. That's not to suggest, however, that I consider the Demon of Hatred to be an easy boss. In fact, I'd say my first experiences fighting it were very similar to my experiences with Lawrence, First Vicar. I must have died about 40 plus times on my first playthrough, because make no mistake, these attacks do take a lot of getting used to, and at times, this fight can be just as much about knowing when to hold back and not attack. The boss does gain a few new attacks in each phase transition, but most of his moveset does remain the same, with the difficulty, intensity and temperature being upped just a bit more as each one of those large health bars are depleted. This can be a long fight, and it'll take a good bit of learning and adaptation, but I flat out consider the Demon of Hatred to be one of the best bosses in Sekiro, and I always have. And as with many standout bosses, there's more to it than just the battle, because this is of course the demonic form of the sculptor who became consumed by the flames of hatred, transforming into a raging, rampaging demon. I didn't actually realise this at first, and so the dialogue as you deliver the final shinobi execution really caught me off guard, and returning back to the dilapidated temple afterwards only to see it now completely empty is a very somber moment. Ah, the Dark Lurker, a boss that many people consider to be the greatest in Dark Souls 2's base game, if not the whole game. I don't rate it quite that highly, but as you can see by the fact that I have it at number 31, I still do think very highly of it, and rightly so. Before we even get into the boss though, again I have to mention the inexplicably torturous and unpleasant bloody run back. The Dark Lurker is of course an optional boss, essentially acting as a reward for getting through all 3 chasms of old as per the Pilgrims of the Dark Covenant. The issue is that if you die to the Dark Lurker, which is more than likely considering it's one of the toughest bosses in the game, then you have to play through one of these chasms of old all over again before you can re-attempt the boss, despite the fact that you've already done the dungeon. Why though? It's the dumbest shit ever, I hate it. If I wasn't a fairer man, I'd let it impact my judgment of Dark Lurker itself. However, as bafflingly, needlessly punishing as the runback is, the Dark Lurker is a top tier boss fight. Because of the way it's tied to the chasms, this fight is one of the very rare cases where there's no fog wall to walk through. Instead, you're literally just dropped into the fight with no time to breathe, because the angelic yet haunting form of the Dark Lurker is right there, waiting for you. It's certainly one of the more mysterious looking bosses in the game, with the way its face is completely obscured in darkness under its white hood, if it even has a face at all. And then there's the fact that it has 4 arms, plus at one point in the fight the Dark Lurker divides into 2 for double the trouble. Unlike most cases of boss duplication though, there's not a real version and a fake one here, but rather both are real, and as such they both take real damage. Even though my opinion of Dark Souls 2 has deteriorated a bit over the years, it's still a game I've finished probably 15 damn times or something, at least, and so I'm pretty damn good at it, but the Dark Lurker fight still gives me trouble. For as much as I do hate the runback, I will say that it also has the effect of putting some extra pep in my step, because I never want to die here and have to play through a whole fucking dungeon again for no reason. Well, we are in the region of the top 30 Soulsborne bosses now. This is serious stuff, folks, where it gets extra difficult to choose who deserves to go where, but I've done my best. I'm sure it won't please everyone, but hey, you can't please everyone, so why try? At number 30, I have selected Velstadt, the Royal Aegis, who I consider to be the best boss in Dark Souls 2's base game. Velstadt is encountered at the end of the Undead Crypt after the Shrine of Amana, kneeling as if in prayer within a solitary circle of light shining in from above, beyond which lies the shambling remains of the now hollowed King Vendrick. Here are some of my favourite things about Velstadt as a boss. Everything. I love that sick armour, the enormous bell chime hammer it uses, the weight and heft of its powerful slams and swings, how dramatic and confrontational his soundtrack is, and even his placement here, still defending his king in this dark crypt. It's not an especially technical or difficult fight, but it is difficult enough, and Velstadt also has a second phase where his weapon and body become imbued with the dark, adding an extra layer of intrigue to this character where despite his fixation with the light, he still became at least partially corrupted by the dark because of his time spent down here. Velstadt is not alone in this list though, because I also consider his brother, who appears in the Crown of the Iron King DLC, to be an incredible boss, and he too will be getting a shout out in due time. At number 29 we have the boss which comes directly after the group encounter with the living failures at the top of the research hall. Bloodborne did of course come before Dark Souls 3, which means Lady Maria came before the rather similar Sister Frieda, though of the two bosses I do prefer Maria. Like I said, for as great a boss as Frieda was, one of my critiques was that her third phase in particular feels that the game's throwing too much at me. Too many fast combos and elemental vortexes. With Maria though, I can't really use that excuse, because this is Bloodborne, and Bloodborne is a faster paced game. Even so, that's not to say that just because Bloodborne has more appropriate mechanics that I excel at fighting Maria, because I don't. She's really fast, has very off-putting delayed attacks with long animations and sudden long-range slashes and stabs, and just like Sister Frieda, she has 3 distinct phases, though thankfully just the one large health bar. Her second phase ups the intensity by adding an additional blood element to her attacks, giving her extra damage and range, but then in the third phase, of course, Now everything has to be set on fucking fire, and so now you've got both the blood and fire effects to watch out for, and by Jove it gets very difficult and intense. Honestly, if it weren't for the fact that you can stagger her with a gun, just like you can with Gehrman, I think Maria would be Bloodborne's most difficult boss, but thankfully she can be staggered out of almost any attack, though at the same time, she can also stagger you and even deliver a unique critical. Honestly though, Maria is one of those bosses that I don't quite love, but where I do think she's absolutely excellent, if that makes sense, and well deserving of such a high spot in the rankings. But why stop there with the femme fatales? Why not talk about Malenia, Blade of Miquella, as well? I have an exceedingly troubled history with Malenia, to the point where I've never struggled on any other boss as much as I have with her. Although I do love Elden Ring, this was not quite the case on my first playthrough, or more specifically, the last third of my first playthrough. As I drew closer to Elden Ring's final stretch, I really started to feel fatigued by both its sheer size and its difficulty. I struggled so much on that playthrough to the extent that I wasn't even having any fun with some of the late game bosses, finding myself more frustrated than enchanted, even with me making frequent use of Spirit Ashes. The peak of my frustration, however, came when I got to Elfale, particularly when I encountered Malenia. By this point I was honestly just ready for the game to be over, but I still wanted to beat all the main bosses before I ended things at the Erdtree, and so for several hours I banged my head against the wall of difficulty that is the Blade of Miquella, getting ravaged by her combos, bodied by her grab attack, and absolutely fucking devastated by Waterfowl Dance every damn time. And even if I did have a promising attempt, well, sooner or later she'd catch me out and just regain most of her HP back, even if I was using a shield, and by that point I'd have used up most of my Crimson Flasks, and that was before I even made it to her more difficult second phase, which comes with an even greater variety of deadly extravagant attacks with an additional element of Scarlet Rot added to them. Oh, the humanity! Were these struggle sessions enjoyable for me? Absolutely not. Did I eventually manage to beat her only with the help of an online phantom? Yes, after some time. But I did of course embark on a second Elden Ring playthrough a month or so later, this time with a better attitude, and where I'd endeavour to not use any Spirit Ashes or even miracles or sorcery, and all I can say is that this made for one of the most enjoyable playthroughs of any game I've ever had. I explored the world way more thoroughly. I found dungeons, side quests and bosses that I'd missed the first time round, and I just flat out was playing better, including when I got to Malenia. I still had a very difficult time, but I beat her solo, and instead of taking me about 6 hours, it took me about 45 minutes, all of which left me with a more positive opinion of her as a boss. Even so, and I'll not mince my words here, I absolutely detest Waterfowl Dance. In fact, I think it's one of the worst attacks in Soulsborne history. Yes, it looks badass, but that's about the only positive thing I have to say about it, and that's because even after gaining a good degree of competency at fighting her, almost every time I died to Malenia, the attack that killed me was Waterfowl Dance. As in, 9 out of 10 times when I died to Malenia, it was that attack that killed me, not her other attacks. Yes, I know there are ways to avoid it, and sometimes I would be able to avoid it, but never consistently, never. Just when I think I'd figured out the correct movements and roll times to evade it, it would clip me or just flat out destroy me, and sorry, but I just don't think it makes for a well designed boss move. Even nowadays, I have to resort to just using a shield for this attack and just let her regain a bunch of her health back. If it weren't for Waterfowl Dance, as well as the fact that she can pull it out surprisingly early in the fight and then many more times after that, Malenia might have been in the top 20 or even the top 10, but as it is, that one attack profoundly affects my ability to enjoy this boss, and so I can't place her any higher than number 28. Urex Gundyr appeared significantly lower on the list, but the main reason for that was his messy second phase, which in my opinion makes him a less than ideal first boss, because rather than being challenged with a selection of clear tight attacks, all of a sudden things take a far more abyssal turn, and the challenge comes from trying to work out what on earth the boss is actually doing with those crazy monstrous animations. Well, Fortunately, that first encounter isn't the last time you see Gundyr, because he returns again in his champion form in the untended graves area much later, and here the whole pus of man element has been ripped out, and what you're left with is one of the most fast paced and straightforwardly enjoyable boss battles in the game. Not only that though, but he's been buffed in just about every way, having way more attacks, combos and tricks. I'm not saying that I wish they'd have you fighting something as complex as this as an early game boss, but this is the way Gundyr is meant to be challenged. Just like with Pontiff Sullivan, if you're competent enough at Dark Souls 3's parrying, this can be used against Gundyr to great effect, but sadly I am incompetent at parrying in this game, and so that's not an option for me. Regardless, sick boss. Ornstein and Smough, the notorious level boss of Anor Londo, the one that everyone warns you about when you're on your first run of the game, and for good reason. Anor Londo itself is a demanding level, especially if you're not the best at taking on its Silver Knights, but most first time players are not ready for the double, two-phased boss battle which awaits them beyond that enormous fog wall. Sure, you fought the Bell Gargoyles earlier, and sure, there were two of them, but this ain't that. Now, I'll be the first to say that the ONS fight really isn't as mechanically smooth as it could have been. For one, half the time when you enter the arena, Ornstein will kind of bug out a bit and do this weird, absurdly long-range lunging animation right at you from the other side of the hall, which looks really janky and as such can be difficult to avoid. Also, the hitbox of Smough's devastating charge attack is really difficult to not get tagged by, to the point where sometimes when I see it, I just resign myself to the fact that I'm almost certainly going to take some damage. This really isn't the most well-oiled encounter in the Souls series, but even so, it plays such a significant part in giving the game its merciless reputation that I had to include it here. Though don't think that I'm putting it in the top 30 just because of its reputation, because this is a great battle. I remember when I first saw that opening cutscene and how intimidated I was, because I knew I was probably going to be on these guys for a while, but I was also enthralled by how sick they looked. This spear-wielding wolf knight, and then the giant that is Smough with that crazy hammer, which happens to be the single heaviest weapon in Dark Souls 2 by the way. As intimidating as ONS are, the game still does offer up a strategy with the 6 pillars to the sides of the room, allowing you to position yourself behind them so as to not get hit by Smough's brutal charges while you're taking chunks out of Ornstein's health bar. The health situation is another saving grace here, because they really don't have all that much of it, and thus, while these two are very dangerous, this isn't a marathon of a fight, or at least the first phase isn't. As for the second phase, well, it seems that almost everyone who plays the game takes down Ornstein first, leaving them with Super Smough, and no wonder, because I for one have always found Super Ornstein to be way more terrifying. I think it's because Smough seems to stay about the same size for both phases, roughly, whereas Ornstein goes from being relatively normal sized to turning into a giant, and I don't like it. Super Smough does, of course, regain all his health back for phase 2, as well as getting a big increase to his max health, and now he does even more damage and gets an extra lightning butt slam AoE attack. Got to say though, I've never been a big fan of this particular attack. Smough uses it too frequently to the point where sometimes he just spams it, and your only option when he does use it is to just run away, though things aren't any better with Super Ornstein either, because he also gets the same attack. Despite the odd issue or two I have with this boss battle, it's legendary, it's notorious, it's fucking iconic, it's a Soulsborne classic. Out of all the Soulsborne games, the one with the most interesting and flavourful world and lore is Bloodborne, though Elden Ring does come very close. There are many interesting beasts, higher beings and significant figures located in and around Yharnam who all have varying degrees of darkness and madness associated with their characters, and it's all great and nightmarish and very compelling, but my favourite character of them all has to be Father Gascoigne. You can of course interact with Gascoigne's daughter in central Yharnam before the fight, who asks after her mother before gifting you with a music box, a trinket which his family used to play for him when he'd start to forget himself, when the sweet blood would sing to him, tempting him to give in to the beast inside. This is Bloodborne though, and there are no happy endings, and indeed, by the time you make it to the Tomb of Odin, Gascoigne's wife Viola is already dead, having been butchered by the man himself, who then sets his bandage-covered eyes upon you. The first phase of the fight more or less plays out as if you were fighting a regular hunter, because Gascoigne's choice of weapon is the hunter's axe, which might even be the same weapon you come to the fight with, though his movements and animations are that extra bit more savage and bloodthirsty compared to those of a regular hunter. Thankfully though, he can be staggered by your firearm. The second phase is where Gascoigne really comes into his own, fully giving into beasthood and literally exploding into another form, one infinitely more ferocious, dispensing with all man-made weapons in favour of tooth and claw. This phase is designed to punish the panic rolling player, because each time you dash back in terror, Gascoigne is right there to meet you, though again, his aggressiveness can be punished with a stagger, plus he's especially weak against fire here. Mechanically, the Gascoigne fight is excellent and a steep difficulty spike for many first-time Bloodborne players on their way out of Central Yharnam, but it's his backstory, dialogue and even visual design that makes him one of my favourite bosses in the game. I earlier cited Pontiff Sulyvahn as being one of the 3 bosses which gave me an immense headache on my Soul Level 1 run of Dark Souls 3, with Soul of Cinder being another, but as well as that there was also the Dancer of the Boreal Valley, which honestly must have taken about 70 attempts before I beat it. Challenge run nonsense aside though, I love everything about the Dancer. She was also one of the first bosses people even saw of the game back before Dark Souls 3 even came out, because I remember some YouTubers and press being invited to an event to try out the game and take her on, though I believe her name used to be Dancer of the Frigid Valley, just like how the Looking Glass Knight used to be called the Mirror Knight. You can really see why they chose her to showcase the game too, because she has one of the weirdest and most interesting visual designs and animations in the game, appearing deformed and alien yet still possessing a strange grace, and just like how they gave Vort a fantastic intro cutscene, the same is true of the Dancer. This is a late game boss of course, required to be defeated so as to gain entry to Lothric Castle, but if you want to take her on early, even before fighting Vort, then you can. I've always liked when games let you do that, even when you have very little chance of actually beating the boss, because there's always a chance that you will beat it, though I distinctly remember thoroughly dispensing with all notions of victory after getting one-shotted by the Dancer's grab attack. There's a really creepy vibe to the whole encounter, and several things contribute to that. For one, there's the excellent soundtrack, and then you've got Dancer's odd proportions and its nearly impossibly hunched moving animation, and the fact that it's really difficult to make out any facial features behind that metallic veil. And like Pontiff Sulyvahn, she uses 2 different swords, each imbued with a different element. When I think of the excellence of Dark Souls 3's bosses, the Dancer is one that I think of, and several others still to come. We've already covered half of the bosses found in Dark Souls 1's Artorias of the Abyss DLC, but now that we're talking about the best of the best in Soulsborne, it's time to cover the others, and at number 23 we have Manus, Father of the Abyss. Manus is of course the very creature who drags the player back in time to Ulasil from the abyssal portal found in Darkroot Basin, but he also serves as the DLC's final boss, located at the bottom of the Chasm of the Abyss. The Manus fight is one of the very rare cases which features a special, optional item which can only be used against that one specific boss. In the fight against Malekith in Elden Ring, you can use the Blasphemous Claw of course to parry some of Malekith's attacks, but for Manus, if you found the silver pendant behind the illusory wall back in Ulasil Township, then it will offer protection against Manus's 3 dark-based attacks. The fight can still be beaten without this item of course, because these attacks are avoidable conventionally, which is nice, but still I always appreciate a unique touch with a boss, plus the silver pendant animation is really sick. Manus has always had a reputation as being a very tough boss, but got to be honest, I've never quite found this to be the case. It's fast, does high damage and has devastating combos, we all know the particular combo I'm talking about, but even with those special dark attacks I've never really struggled with Manus all that much, though that's not meant as a slight. Rather, this is just a great fight with an enormous primeval monster. The runback could have been a bit less shitty though, because I've never been too big a fan of having to run all the way back through the chasm every time I die, but I'm not going to deduct points for that here. Manus makes for a brilliant conclusion to a brilliant DLC, though there is a certain other Dark Souls 1 DLC boss who I consider to be even better than Manus. Oh, who could it be? The fight against Genichiro was one that I completely missed upon first reaching Ashina Castle. Just like how my first run of Elden Ring didn't go quite as well as it probably could have, the same is true of Sekiro, because when I got to the Ashina Castle area, I didn't realise that you could actually get in the castle, and so instead I just travelled through the abandoned dungeon to Senpu Temple and even reached the end of that large level, though the actual doors to the temple itself were close to me. Because turns out you can get inside the castle and you're supposed to take on Genichiro at the top, so I went back and did that. That story wasn't quite as interesting as I thought it would be, sorry. Sekiro is a super tough game right from the get-go, from the regular enemies, sure, but also the mini-bosses and definitely the regular bosses. You first encounter Genichiro in the tutorial, but it's one of those fights where even if you manage to win, you still just lose anyway in the cutscene which follows, and with no special reward either way. Later on though, after honing your skills as a shinobi a great deal more, and with the aid of the shinobi prosthetic, Wolf once again encounters Genichiro, and this time it's more of a fair fight. Mind you, Genichiro still has 2 health bars to deplete, and then even after those are gone, he has another phase altogether with brand new attacks, including the Lightning of Tomoe. I remember hearing a lot of people struggling with this fight, and no wonder. The game demands a lot of you up until this point, but with the Genichiro fight it demands even greater precision and faster reactions. Genichiro has long combos with very specific timings. He has a great bow, which he'll often use specifically to punish you for healing, and he even has a perilous attack mix-up where you need to watch him really closely to figure out whether he's going to use a thrust, a sweep or a regular attack. Most of the same difficulty is present in his second form, but with the added pressure of the lightning attacks, though these actually end up being an unexpected help to the point where you want him to use them. A successful lightning counter results in big damage to both health and posture, and the counter really isn't too difficult to pull off once you get the hang of it, but it does look and feel very satisfying, especially if you're out of heals and are getting desperate. It's a difficult fight for sure, but I actually think its difficulty is perfect for this stage in the game because it lets you know what's demanded of you, and certain later game bosses go on to trivialise the challenge of even this encounter. At number 21, I have chosen Gwyn, Lord of Cinder. You see this legendary figure in the game's opening cutscene, and you hear other characters talk about him, and you even traverse his grand castle in Anor Londo, but it's not until the very end of the game, at the end of the Kiln of the First Flame beneath Firelink Shrine, that you actually meet him, though by this point he's been reduced to a smaller, burnt up husk of his former, greater self due to the extent to which his powerful soul has served as kindling for the fire. Even so, he still makes for a more than formidable opponent, an outstanding final boss with one of the most beautiful soundtracks of all time. It's used very effectively here too, the way it hits you as soon as you step through that fog gate. It's sad and sombre and does so much to turn this encounter into something a bit more than a boss. As weepy-eyed and emotional as the music can make me though, this is anything but some soft, simple encounter, because Gwyn, it's hands down the most aggressive boss in the game. Even if you arrive here with 20 Estus flasks, the issue is that it's really difficult to actually use them without getting hit in the process and cancelling out the heal if you even survive at all. He's always on you, slashing away with his long blazing sword combos, complete with the occasional kick or grab mix-up. Years ago, a buddy of mine played through the game whilst I watched, and over the weeks he made it all the way to the end, all the way to Gwyn, and then gave up. He just couldn't beat him. He tried and tried, maybe 60 times or more, but nope, could not do it, and that was that. He never ended up beating the game. Gwyn is really tough, but something that makes him more frustrating than he needs to be is the unnecessarily long run back. The Kiln of the First Flame is an incredible looking area, and I love how every Black Knight variant appears here, but why do you have to run through this whole area every time you die? I've ragged on Dark Souls 2 a lot for its runbacks, and so I have to do the same here. I think this runback is one of the worst in the series, and it's one people don't really talk about all that much, I guess because of how great a boss Gwyn is, but even so it sucks having to do this every time, and it makes it that extra bit frustrating when you do die here. Fortunately, Gwyn can be somewhat trivialised with the use of parries, especially with the use of the Hornet's Ring, and yes, I do sometimes use this strategy, though it does feel kinda cheap, but regardless, Gwyn is one of the greats. At number 20, we have one of the single most powerful, destructive and dangerous beings in all of Soulsborne. It's General Radahn, Scourge of the Stars. Like many, my first exposure to Radahn was in an early cinematic trailer for the game, showing the battle between himself and Malenia, an encounter which would conclude in the complete devastation of an entire region of the lands between, that being Caelid. You hear snippets of information about the general throughout the game, but the most commonly agreed sentiment is that he is, or was, the most powerful demigod of them all. This all serves to make the build up to the actual fight super intense, the way you hear all this talk of a festival, and then there's the rousing speech by Jeren, and then you actually see what remains of Radahn in the accompanying cutscenes, his wits having long since been ravaged by Malenia's scarlet rot, reducing him from an all-powerful demigod to a howling, tortured beast. Despite Radahn's fall from grace, he remains extremely formidable, and even though he's lost most of his former intelligence, his prowess in battle seems largely untouched, to the extent that the intended way to defeat him is with the help of not one phantom, but many. He is absolutely massive. The attacks from his thick twin greatswords boast incredible power and range. He throws out the most savage combos found anywhere in the game, and to top it all off, he is still a master of gravity magic. This comes into play in Phase 1 with his gravitational shockwaves, but especially in Phase 2 where he shoots off into the sky before plunging back down onto the battlefield, as if he were some comet entering through the red atmosphere of Caelid from some outer sphere. While his sweeps and slams are terrifying in Phase 1, this is nothing compared to his violent swirls through the air in Phase 2, all while several enormous purple boulders hang in the air behind him, daring you to drop your guard for just a few seconds only for them to be heaved your way through the air for what can easily be a one-hit kill. I've used the word battle when referring to boss fights many times throughout this long video, but nowhere is it a more accurate term than here at the Radahn Festival, because this is nothing less than a desperate battle against a powerful god beast, and such is Radahn's power that after his defeat, the very stars resume their motion, having only been held in stasis by Radahn, giving you a vivid demonstration of why he was known as the Scourge of the Stars. Anyone who watched my video on the best and worst levels from each Soulsborne game may remember that my number one favourite level from Dark Souls 3 is Lothric Castle. I love a good castle type level, which is one of the reasons why Boletaria is my favourite world from Demon Souls, but Lothric Castle, oofed, it's a good one, because not only do I love playing through it, but it also features not one, but two of my favourite bosses in the game, one of which is the Dragon Slayer armour. I remember seeing the name of this boss somewhere online before I encountered it in-game, thinking, that's a funny name for a boss. We're fighting armour? Well, yes, actually we are. Though that's because it's being possessed and controlled by a particularly enormous pilgrim butterfly who flies off right as the fight begins, remaining at the sidelines to occasionally spray the arena with a damaging red explosive mist. I'm not too sure what the exact lore relationship is between the armour and the character of Ornstein, because to be honest I'm surprisingly ignorant of a lot of the finer details of Dark Souls lore, but I do love how much larger, more warped and heavy it is here. Ornstein's armour certainly had a real heaviness to it in the first game, but it did not look crude, whereas this armour, and especially the weapon and shield, are definitely crude. The boss's great shield in particular just looks like an enormous hunk of twisted iron, and the axe has similar attributes, with weight, power and toughness clearly taking priority here over any sort of refinement or elegance, and all this comes through in the Dragon Slayer armour's fighting style. You know me by now, I love a strong sense of heaviness and impact with my bosses. I want to see the screen shake, I want to feel the attacks through the fucking screen, and the Dragon Slayer armour boss fight gives me exactly what I desire in that regard, and then some, and hey, the intense roaring soundtrack really doesn't hurt either, does it? While I don't think the Dragon Slayer armour is the best boss in Dark Souls 3, that's only because Dark Souls 3 has a bunch of top tier bosses, soon to be mentioned, but god damn it, I love this fight. Like I said a few entries ago when talking about the Gwyn fight, an emotional element can transcend an encounter into something truly special, especially if the boss you're up against has a tragic backstory, as was absolutely the case with Gwyn. Well, that same tragic element well and truly returns in the fight against Gehrman, another final boss, and with another absolute tearjerker of a soundtrack. For most of the game, Gehrman's role is that of the hunter's helper, there to provide you with wise guidance on the night of the hunt. He's also of course confined to a wheelchair, not to mention that he's also somewhat elderly looking, and no wonder, because Gehrman was of course the very first hunter, even before Ludwig. Well, despite not appearing to be especially threatening, his inner hunter comes out in full force if you reject his offer of supposed mercy at the foot of the tree in the hunter's dream, kicking off the game's final fight, or its penultimate fight if you're due a visit by the Moon Presence. I'd say that the next most similar boss to Gehrman when it comes to fighting style is Lady Maria from the DLC, and no wonder, with Gehrman having been Maria's former mentor. This is a straight up fight between one hunter and another. No beasts, no great ones, and no nightmare creatures. Gehrman uses an early version of a trick weapon with his burial blade, which also becomes available to the player after his defeat. But it adds a good level of variety to the fight, with him seemingly being able to switch from its long scythe form to its shorter blade form at will, also allowing him to use ranged attacks with his hunter's pistol. At the same time though, he is fully vulnerable to staggers, which is by far Gehrman's biggest weakness. In fact, it's kind of another similarity to the Gwyn fight, where you can significantly reduce the challenge with the use of parries, though here the staggers aren't quite as easy to pull off, likely requiring a fair amount of studying his sudden attack timings, just like in the Maria fight. Like many of the best bosses in Soulsborne, Gehrman is a tragic and complex figure, and while the fight itself is one of the best in Bloodborne, everything else about it is just as excellent, from the incredible arena to the soaring soundtrack. Just like I did with all the Asylum Demon type enemies much earlier, I'm going to do another collective entry here with Great Shinobi Owl and Owl Father, due to them being so similar. While I have heard people express disappointment with the Great Shinobi Owl fight, saying it was just a bit too easy, well yeah, not for me. It's a fight I'm good at now, but back on my first playthrough I struggled against Owl, even more so than Genichiro, who you fight earlier in the exact same arena. Owl's appearance here is likely to come as quite a surprise, seeing as how you saw him perish from his battle wounds back in Hirata Estate, but it turns out that he simply faked his death here, and indeed, such a deceptive trick is hardly surprising from a shinobi. Although Owl is Wolf's adoptive father, he is not a good person, and his motives are far from pure, those being to kidnap the divine heir so as to receive his gift of immortality. Trouble is, Kuro is our master in this game, and as such, it's Wolf's duty to protect him, even if it means breaking the Iron Code, and thus begins the fight with the Great Shinobi. Owl is very different from Wolf in stature, being an enormous man and using a far larger weapon, but even so, just as Wolf uses a variety of tools to dazzle and damage with the aid of his shinobi prosthetic, Owl makes use of similar techniques, throwing firecrackers to stun, igniting smoke bombs, dousing sections of the arena in poison, and even throwing orbs to cause a small green AoE which temporarily prevents you from healing, just like being hit with a Void's Talisman in Dark Souls. Even aside from all these tricks though, Owl is a formidable swordsman, doing massive damage with his powerful sword attacks, and he even has the unique ability to directly counter your thrust attacks unless you catch him off guard. He'll also just block most of your attacks, much like the Corrupted Monk, and so a focus on posture build-up tends to work more effectively than health depletion. The Great Shinobi Owl fight is suitably superb, considering Wolf is fighting his former father and mentor here, but this is not Owl at his peak. Although it's an easy fight to miss unless you're going for the purification ending, returning to Hirata Estate later on in the same blazing arena where we defeated Lady Butterfly gives you the opportunity to fight Owl, Father, and this version of the Great Shinobi is considerably more difficult. Although a knowledge of Owl's tricks from the previous fight will give you something of an upper hand, he also plays off this knowledge by tossing in follow-up attacks, or even cancelling animations altogether to catch you off guard. His arsenal of trickery is also expanded here, not to mention his health and damage potential. Speaking of enhanced trickery, in Phase 2 Owl gains the ability to seemingly transform into a blue spectral owl, providing him with enhanced movement through the arena and additional offensive capabilities, and it all feels so much more demanding compared to the first time you fought him. In fact, with the exception of the special boss versions you can unlock via all the gauntlet content, Owl Father is the second most difficult fight in the game, to the point where by the time I eventually beat him, I am straight up relieved. Number 15 is a special one in this list because this is the last entry where you're going to hear me use the words gimmick fight. After this, the bosses are comparatively more straightforward, though certainly not conventional in every case. My pick here is Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, and for the third and thus far final time in Soulsborne, the use of a special giant killing weapon is involved, that being the Serpent Hunter. Its usefulness is no secret of course, with the weapon already having been placed in front of you right as you enter Rykard's hellish lair, but it makes the battle significantly more manageable, both its god-devouring first phase, then the blasphemous second phase with Rykard himself. It is entirely possible to defeat Rykard even without the spear, and I've seen people do it, but it looks absolutely miserable and there's no good reason to try it, other than bragging rights. The first phase really isn't super complex, and the Serpent doesn't have a huge selection of moves, but the moves it does have are big, explosive, and sometimes poisonous. It can be fairly difficult, but as with many other bosses with two distinct phases, the Serpent is meant more as a tense precursor to the real fight, because in phase 2, Rykard reveals his vile features, showcasing one of FromSoft's weirdest but most disturbingly memorable boss designs, and then Rykard starts to speak in that garbled hissing manner, and it's all so messed up and awesome. FromSoft are among the best at disturbing boss designs, and there's been a ton of them in this list. I honestly think Rykard is their most disturbing and even disgusting. The way his serpentine body is sliced open down the middle is grotesque, and even his signature blasphemous blade weapon is constantly wriggling and writhing and moving in his hands. To fight, he's unusually difficult for a gimmick boss, though at the same time the massive chunks of damage you can do with the Serpent Hunter does a lot to keep you from feeling outclassed by Rykard's size and power, and with a wee bit of practice you can get to the point where you're breezing through the first phase. Despite the weapon's power though, there are times in phase 2 where all you can really do is run the fuck away, dodging and sprinting away from the demigod's screaming skull projectiles as the already morbid, scorched and gory arena becomes ever more chaotic. Not every boss in Elden Ring is a winner, but one thing's for sure, it never disappoints when it comes to the demigod fights. They are always as epic and intense as they should be, and Rykard is no exception. This is the last Dark Souls 2 boss on the list, but even so, heck, number 14 ain't bad at all, and I'm very glad to have him on here. It's the Fume Knight from the Crown of the Old Iron King DLC. There are a lot of great bosses from both the base game and DLCs, but for me, the Fume Knight takes the cake. I have died many times to this boss, from the slashes and stabs from its smaller sword to the slow heated arcs from its Fume Ultra Greatsword, and everything in between, but I'm glad, because even when I was struggling with the Fume Knight's range of high damaging attacks and his very large pool of health, I was enjoying every damn minute of it. Sure, some people complained about how many of Dark Souls 2's bosses were just dudes in armour, but for me, some of those dudes in armour happen to be my favourite bosses in the game, like the Pursuer, Looking Glass Knight, the Dragon Rider, Velstadt, and then the ultimate dude in armour, with what might just be the ultimate sword, holy shit that thing's massive, the Fume Knight, who also happens to be Velstadt's brother in the lore, to the extent that if you enter the fog wall wearing Velstadt's helmet, the boss will transition straight to phase 2, right from the start, which is pretty deep. This is also another one of those bosses that, while I did struggle a great deal at first, I can take on very comfortably now to the point where I can usually beat him on my first try, and look, I earned that. I paid my dues, I died to this guy enough. What more can I say about the Fume Knight? I think he's the best boss in Dark Souls 2, and one of the all-time Soulsborne greats, and I salute him for it. Just a few entries of the list, I spoke about how challenging and intense the fight with Owl Father was, and indeed, I consider him to be the second hardest in Sekiro, but as for the number 1 most difficult, and my entry for number 13, I'm choosing Ishin Sword Saint, the final boss for all but one of the game's 4 endings. Of course, you fight Ishin Ashnith to close out the Shura ending, but while that does make for a difficult boss, it's nothing compared to the real deal, the Sword Saint who climbs out of the corpse of his adopted grandson, Genichiro. Genichiro serves as the precursor to the fight with Ishin, but apart from one new attack he has with the use of the other Mortal Blade, all his techniques are very familiar to the extent that you can quickly get very good at deflecting his attacks to deliver a swift death blow, and due to the merciless difficulty of the true final boss here, you'll likely have ample opportunity to take on Genichiro again and again. Although I do think there are 2 or perhaps even 3 more difficult bosses in Elden Ring, when Sekiro first came out, Ishin was the hardest boss they'd ever came up with, hands down. He has the most varied moveset in the game, has massive damage dealing potential, and just when you think you're starting to nail his first phase, he pulls out a spear and pistol in the second phase and becomes twice as difficult. And I really do think the second phase is where the true challenge lies. The first is difficult, and you will die several times, but even so, the inherent rhythm of it gradually starts to make sense, especially when he's throwing out thrust attacks for easy, posture building Makiri counters. But for phase 2, well, I've never gotten competent at it. I've gotten better, sure, but try as I might, I always get overwhelmed here. His range increases, he gets access to more special attacks, he does more damage, the combos become fucking outrageous, and the animations become more dramatic to the point where it's difficult to nail down exactly when you're supposed to deflect sometimes. I never have an easy time with phase 2, and I likely never will, but hey, I don't think this is a boss you're ever supposed to get comfortable with, so I'm okay with it. Thankfully, phase 3 really isn't quite so bad, because just as Genichiro does at the end of his battle, Isshin pulls out the lightning of Tomoe, offering you fairly easy opportunities for big health and posture damage, though he's still very threatening here and has still ended many a run for me, and the fact that my poor heart is normally pounding by this point also adds to the pressure. Honestly, Isshin is one of those bosses that's so intensely difficult that I don't even look forward to fighting him, and I'm always exceedingly glad when he's down, but even so, he is one of FromSoft's most incredible creations and plays a major role in giving Sekiro its well-earned reputation as one of FromSoft's hardest games. Just like with the Millennia fight, my early encounters with Mohg were not especially enjoyable, although a major difference between these experiences is that on my first playthrough I somehow smoked him after just a few attempts by simply running up and hitting him with everything I had. To be honest, I don't really know how I did this because I wasn't very good at the game back then, and as I later realised, Mohg is one of the hardest bosses in the game, and one of the best. There are many things which make the Lord of Blood so challenging, but most of my initial deaths were caused by me seeing him start an animation from a certain distance, and then I thought, there's no way that attack's going to reach me, only for that attack to then reach me and often kill me. He has very long range with his sacred spear weapon, to the point where it's deceptively long, though the frequent follow-up blood flame explosions certainly don't help matters when you're desperately trying to avoid damage. And the delayed Blood Flame Talon's attack is designed to catch you out because while it looks like the initial sanguine swipe does damage, it doesn't. It's the following explosion that nails you. I always appreciate a nice bit of in-fight dialogue, and so obviously I'm a big fan of Mohg's Latin countdown, though I have always found the mandatory damage which follows during the transition to phase 2 to be a bit questionable. Mandatory damage isn't common in Soulsborne bosses, but it does happen occasionally, and it always rubs me the wrong way a bit, because this is a series where if you're good enough at the game, it doesn't matter how difficult the boss is, you can beat it, damage free. You can beat Millennia at level 1 with no armour and your bare fists if you've got the skill, which I don't by the way, because all damage is avoidable, even waterfall dance, but then Mohg comes along and no, you can't not take damage unless you manage to beat him before the phase 2 transition. Yes, you can get this special crystal tier, but this only negates most of the damage, not all of it. I will stop bitching about this now though, because it's hardly a serious issue I have, it's more of a principle thing. Despite it, the Mohg fight is incredible and incredibly intense, especially when he grows dark wings in phase 2 and starts spraying blood flame everywhere. This is one of those fights where the boss is just always on you, always doing something, always hunting you down, regardless of how far away he is, because even if you've got a bit of range, he can just throw blood flame your way and then catch you as you're sprinting or rolling to avoid it. He's so aggressive that it can be difficult to even know when to attack, and this can straight up extend the length of the fight because of how carefully you need to pick your moments. Mohg is one of those bosses where the more I fight him, the more I like him. Yes, I've been known to get frustrated at the intensity of phase 2, but even in these moments, I can't deny how sick it all is, and very, very bloody. I consider the Orphan of Cause to be the second greatest boss in Bloodborne, though I did really have to think about whether it might be the first greatest. Second place in a game as good as this though is no disgrace, and not only is Orphan of Cause among the best in the game, but it's absolutely among the hardest. Though I have covered a handful of other bosses which aren't immediately aggressive to the player when you first encounter them, it's slightly different when you meet Orphan of Cause. After crawling out of the steaming womb of its mother's beached corpse, it will stare up longingly at the moon, and if you don't approach it here, it won't actually attack you. I mean, it's not like you can just turn around and leave or anything, but still, very cool detail showing that it only seems to be guarding its mother's body against yet another blood-crazed hunter. Orphan's weapon of choice is very unique, being a large, squirming placenta attached to its arm which it swings and slams around the shore, of course screaming and shrieking the entire time, just as the best Bloodborne bosses do. Orphan is quite aggressive here, but not absurdly so, and it will slow the pace sometimes to allow you to attack or heal, though just as with the Maria and German fights and the similarly sized blood-starved beast, Orphan can be staggered. Phase 1 is downright hard, but Phase 2 is just on the cusp of being too fucking much. Here, the aggression is massively increased, as well as the damage, ferocity and speed, and with even more ranged attacks as it showers you in sprays of rancid red fluid, freshly ripped straight out of its fleshy placenta. Orphan's second phase actually reminds me of Moog's in the way you barely get a moment to breathe, and when there's an equal focus on just not dying as there is in dealing actual damage to the thing. Whilst I have gotten reasonably comfortable with Orphan's first phase over my many playthroughs of the DLC, this is not the case with the second phase. It is wild, frantic and desperate, which was clearly exactly what FromSoft were going for, and it all makes for one of the greatest and most terrifying encounters in the game. Well folks, this is it. The top 10, the absolute best of the best out of all 7 of these games. Soulsborne's finest, the pantheon of legends, and I think a perfect pick. To kick off this countdown of greats is Dragon Lord Placidusax, the secret boss of crumbling Farum Azula. Placidusax is the ultimate dragon. Yes, Dark Eater Midir, Black Dragon Kalameet and Leech Dragon Fortisax are fantastic fights, but the Lord among them is the most ancient anomalous dragon of them all, the two-headed titan floating within some distant Colosseum existing in some different time. Right from the start, you can tell this isn't going to be an ordinary dragon battle. Placidusax is absolutely enormous, has 2 heads with a stump where there was once a third, has scales that are so ancient and weathered that they look to be nearly petrified, and perhaps most strikingly of all, is the only being in the game which breathes bright golden fire. The dragon makes frequent use of red lightning too, which it calls forth with mighty roars, though one of its most awe-inspiring attacks, the one which is so powerful that even the music hushes in anticipation of the coming blast, is its Bolt of Placidusax, a move that's surprisingly easy to avoid but does an amazing job of displaying the Dragon Lord's impossible power. A very important aspect of the fight though is to know when to back off. This isn't one where you can just hug the rear and go to town. No. You will be fried with its golden flames if you try this, or at the very least flattened by its body or swiped with claws made of phantom red lightning. Placidusax has a second phase too of course, and a surprising aspect of it is that it's initiated by the dragon seemingly disintegrating into the air, only to be seen making a short circuit of the Colosseum in cloud form before reappearing for a sequence of thunderous swipes. An attack that's even more of a ruinous, explosive spectacle than its bolt attack, however, is Placidusax's Ruin, seeming to be something of an homage to a similar attack used by Dark Eater Midir, except with lasers coloured with the brightest gold rather than the dark. Between the time of Demon Souls and the time of Elden Ring, there have been countless dragon battles, and some have been excellent, but none have managed to match Dragon Lord Placidusax, and I'm not sure this dragon can ever be matched. Now this entry is a bit of an unconventional one, I know, because mechanically I don't really love the first phase of the fight. The Guardian Ape is a bit awkward to fight in that I've never quite understood whether the game wants me to deflect or dodge the ape's attacks, and I actually have similar feelings about the Blazing Bull fight from earlier on in the game. Nonetheless, the large open arena is fantastic, especially the way you're clearly encouraged to grapple from tree to tree to help avoiding certain attacks, but also the way the ape can just destroy these trees as the fight drags on. And the design of the ape itself is fantastic, the way it's doing all this with a massive sword sticking out of its neck. That's pretty badass. But the prime reason the Guardian Ape is so far up on this list is because of the second phase of the fight. That first time I thought I'd finally beaten it, only for it to start squirming before getting up and undulating around the arena, mimicking the motion of a worm, has to be one of my favourite video game moments ever, from any game. It's grotesque and creepy, and the way that music shifts in Phase 2 to sound more dissonant and high-pitched is genius, especially when it's complemented by the terror-inducing shrieks from the headless ape itself, only for it to carry on slashing at you with uncanny grace from the enormous katana that had been buried deep into its neck just moments before. It's not just the sheer surprising awesomeness of that phase transition that I do love though, because Phase 2 itself is also one of the best fights in the game. In a way, it's actually more straightforward than the first phase, despite the boss not having a head. Here it's all about bold deflections, then the occasional evasion after a perilous attack, so that raising its posture bar will likely be the goal for most people, rather than trying to deplete all its health like in the first phase. Yes, they did go and shit all over this fight with the headless ape encounter afterwards, but despite how much I dislike that boss, I still love this one. I love it, and I will never forget that moment when I realised the battle was far from over. As outstanding as the Old Hunters DLC is, it actually takes a wee while before you encounter the first boss, and it builds the anticipation as you wonder what the hell the game's going to throw at you, travelling through twisted, incomplete nightmare versions of the Cathedral Ward in central Yharnam, then through a river of blood. But it's the source of the blood which brings you to Ludwig, first hunter of the church, now transformed into the most monstrous, frenzied beast seen so far. It's a terrifyingly difficult fight as you're set upon by tooth and stomped on with hoof, and despite how many times I've beaten Bloodborne, this nightmare version of Ludwig can still give me nightmares before I work out how and when to dodge its ferocious onslaught of primal attacks, always accompanied by some of the loudest, most bestial shrieks of any enemy in the game, putting even the cleric beast and Vicar Amelia to shame. Ludwig is an extremely tough boss, but you gradually work out how to deal with it, and then Phase 2 happens, introducing that familiar pale blade of legend, the Holy Moonlight Sword, and all of a sudden, Ludwig regains some lost sentience, even speaking in a refined English accent, which is probably the last thing you expect after the shrieking cacophony of the first phase. Phase 2 plays out very differently to the first, though the actual difficulty level pretty much remains about the same, except instead of avoiding bites, stomps and violent charges, now you're dashing out of the way of blue sword slashes and arcane AoE attacks, all while one of the greatest video game pieces of music thunders in the background with Ludwig's theme. Incredible boss in all regards, and in my opinion the single greatest boss in Bloodborne, though there was some stiff competition with the likes of Orphan of Kos and Gehrman, but as superb as both these fights were, the number 8 spot goes to Ludwig. I'm sure everyone feels all sorts of different emotions when they first step through that golden fog gate to enter inside the Erdtree for the very first time, and with you having just defeated Godfrey, first Elden Lord, Christ knows what the game's going to throw at you in there. Well, what the game throws at you is Radagon of the Golden Order, the secret side of Queen Marika, who transforms into her male avatar before our very eyes, initiating one of the most challenging fights in the game, with one of the hypest soundtracks kicking in as Radagon's internal Elden Ring glows a bright gold. By this very late point in the game, you're used to the fact that most of what you fight will attack you with varying degrees of savagery and urgency. Some of your foes come in the form of demigods, some are tarnished, some are constructs, and some are dragons, and some come in other forms altogether, but they seldom take their time in getting to where you are and then attempting to fuck you up. Well, Radagon also has the ability to thoroughly fuck you up, but the distinctive thing about this boss is the way he moves around the arena with a unique calmness, or even dare I say, grace. Even with his attack animations, many have a sort of powerful slowness to them, not a sluggishness, but a certain deliberateness, be it from a golden stomp, a sequence of swings from his hammer, or an explosive slam. Honestly, I enjoy looking at Radagon's movements and attacks just about as much as I enjoy actually engaging with them, because I love the ever-present themes of order, grace and gold in Elden Ring, and Radagon is the living embodiment of all those three elements, even having attacks which flash the enigmatic form of the Elden Ring itself onto the ground before you. Yes, lots of folk had this larger battle somewhat soured as a result of the follow-up fight against the Elden Beast, but Elden Beast or no, Radagon of the Golden Order is a god among bosses, and more than worthy to be included in the top 10. Stormvale Castle is one of Elden Ring's best levels, and if it weren't for the existence of Leyndell, then it would be my favourite level in the game. As intricate, expansive and dangerous as the castle is though, the highlight of it comes at the end when you encounter your first demigod, the grotesque abomination that is Godric the Grafted. There isn't a single demigod fight in Elden Ring that disappoints, and quite right too. These are supposed to be the most powerful beings in the lands between, descendants from Queen Marika herself and bearers of shards of the Elden Ring. Well, Godric is certainly not the most brave or noble of these demigods, but nonetheless, he's resorted to a psychopathic practice known as grafting, defeating the Tarnished who come to the castle to oppose him before robbing them of their limbs, attaching them to his ever-expanding frame to the point of true body horror. The grafting has clearly had a profound effect on his strength too, because Godric makes for a formidable opponent and an incredible first demigod. He'll roll around the gravestone-littered arena to deliver powerful leaping attacks with his axe, or storm-based projectiles from range. And such is Godric's strength that he can cause many quakes from the sheer force of slamming his enormous axe into the ground, and I always love any attack in this game that encourages me to jump over it. It's why I also love Godfrey's stomp attack later on in the game, same with the Crucible Knights. With all these additional limbs being attached to his body, with arms being attached to more arms and legs being attached to more legs, there's a disturbing wrongness to the way Godric moves and attacks, especially with just how deceptively quick he can be, though I've always found the most disturbing and awesome moment in the fight to be the phase transition where he removes an arm, my favourite, and then grafts a literal dragon head to his blood spurting stump. I repeat, the man attaches a dragon onto his arm. Was there ever any doubt that Godric would be appearing in the top 10? I was already hooked into Elden Ring when making my way through the dark depths and blighted battlements of Stormvale Castle, but when I encountered Godric, I couldn't stop smiling during his intro cutscene, and when I saw that transition cutscene, I couldn't wait to just die so I could watch it again. And by that same token, whenever I start a fresh playthrough of Elden Ring, I can't wait to get to Stormvale Castle so I can relive the battle once again. We have talked about every boss from the first Dark Souls game, all except one, the boss that I consider to be the greatest of them all, Knight Artorias from the Artorias of the Abyss DLC. You hear tales of Artorias throughout the base game of course, and even fight his loyal great grey wolf deep within Darkwood Forest, but it's not until venturing through Ulasil on the DLC that we finally encounter the legendary knight himself, though by this time the cloying taint of the Abyss has long since robbed him of his capacity for reason, just as it would later do to the Abyss Watchers in Dark Souls 3. Artorias makes for one of the most challenging bosses in the game, with his dexterous swipes, thrusts and leaps from all the way across the boss arena. He's a very aggressive enemy, perhaps not quite as aggressive as Gwyn, but even so you need to pick your moments for attacking and healing well, because he's fast and can move from one side of the arena to the other before you know it. The whole abyssal corruption element of this character is pushed very strongly with the trails of dark sludge he leaves behind when he moves, even going so far as to use this as an attack. This also comes into play when Artorias attempts to buff, drastically increasing his damage output. It isn't a phase 2 as such, because very few bosses from the early Souls games actually featured multiple phases, but if he manages to get the buff off, it increases his threat level significantly. You can of course interrupt this buff, but it means running directly to him to frantically attack before it succeeds, which it sometimes will despite your best efforts. Like pretty much any Dark Souls 1 boss, the Artorias fight isn't especially technical. He doesn't have a huge array of attacks, and nor is he among the most difficult Soulsborne encounters, but while all these things do matter and do help, they're not essential for a legendary boss, because to me, Knight Artorias absolutely is legendary in his presence, design, story, and sheer enjoyability. He is Dark Souls 1 at its best. I earlier spoke about how Lothric Castle was my number one favourite level in Dark Souls 3 during my discussion of the incredible boss that is Dragonslayer armour, but there's one more boss to talk about from that level. The only remaining Lord of Cinders, and my favourite of them all. It's Prince Lothric and his brother Lorien, the Elder Prince. I absolutely love a good intro cutscene which expands on a boss's character with interesting and insightful dialogue, and that is exactly what I get with the Twin Princes, and then again in the transition cutscene to Phase 2.
Although it is specifically Lothric whose remains must be collected and placed on the highest throne back in Firelink Shrine, the main enemy for most of the battle is Lorien, a powerful hero of the kingdom who has since been reduced to a far more bestial form, even having lost the use of his legs, and now without the ability to even speak. Despite this, he makes for a singularly powerful opponent, legs or not, but the main contributing factor which adds to the challenge of the fight is Lorien's constant ability to teleport, although the teleporting is actually being done by Lothric, a figure who may be frail of body but who possesses the ability to perform powerful miracles, aiding his brother in battle from above. It's an extremely cool idea for a boss which is used to incredible effect because the teleports aren't done at random. They are directly tied into specific attack animations to the point where Lorien will sometimes begin an animation, get teleported to a different spot, then deliver the actual attack. And if that isn't one of the all-time coolest boss mechanics, then I don't know what is. The second phase plays out somewhat similarly to the first, except here Lothric joins the battle more directly after having revived his brother, an act which he will perform every time you deplete Lorien's HP, and thus the aim here is to take out Lothric, who almost tenderly hangs from his brother's back. The brotherhood aspect of the fight is very well done, to the point where you almost feel bad for coming up here and disturbing them, then forcefully taking Lothric's ashes back to Firelink despite his wish to simply let the fire fade. Excellent fight, which is again flavoured by one of my favourite boss ingredients, tragedy. Now, I don't know about you, viewer, but by the time I first got to the end of Dark Souls 3, I was moved. In fact, I'd actually booked a whole week off work in anticipation of the game's release, just so I could play it every day, which is exactly what I did, and when I did complete the game, I remember thinking, that might be the best game I've ever played. Now, I don't think quite that strongly about Dark Souls 3 these days, although I do still love it, but the game just did such an amazing job of absorbing me into its cold, dying world, whether you choose to link the flame or let it die. But before you earn the right to do either of those things, the Soul of Cinder must first be defeated. There is one boss in Dark Souls 3's DLC that I like even more than Soul of Cinder, but as far as the base game goes, this is the best fight. The first phase makes use of a variety of different playstyles, imitations of typical builds the player themselves might have used during their time with these games, from a dex-focused curved sword pyromancy style to a more balanced sword style and even a pure magic style, with the boss's coiled sword changing forms and serving as different types of weapons suited to each style. Not all of these are equally easy or difficult to deal with though. In particular, I've always had a nightmare with the curved sword form, to the extent that I sometimes just stay the fuck away from the boss until it switches. But it's an extremely cool idea which is unique to the Soul of Cinder, because I believe the idea here is that you're fighting an incarnation of every former Lord of Cinder combined into one, which must be defeated before you earn the right to link your soul to the flame. Then phase 2 happens and Gwyn's theme kicks in and you see it start to use some of Gwyn's attacks, and oh my god, it makes for one of the most amazing moments in the Dark Souls trilogy. I don't care if the game sometimes went a bit too heavy with the references to Dark Souls 1, because when it hits me with shit like this, I'm all in, and the boss even throws out lightning spears, which is one of those attacks that Gwyn should have had in the first game. Soul of Cinder is the perfect conclusion to one of the greatest video game trilogies of all time. Yes, there were the DLCs of course, but putting them aside for a minute, this conclusion was perfection, and as I watched the ending cutscene and as the credits rolled, I felt a real pang of sadness that the Dark Souls story was over, but also grateful I was there for the ride. Godfrey has my favourite moveset of any boss in Elden Ring. In fact, even though he is in the number 2 spot, I'd go a step further and say that he is my favourite moveset of any Soulsborne boss. There's a mysterious element which can come into play when taking on certain Soulsborne bosses. It's not there for every fight, but every now and then when on some tough encounter, perhaps on your 10th or 11th attempt or more, you enter into a flow, a state of being where you and the boss are engaged in a dance, a mortal test of rhythm, and I feel that Godfrey's moveset facilitates this flow better than any other boss, particularly with his frequent foot stomps encouraging the use of jumps. By the time you finally meet Godfrey, there's been an immense level of legend and hype associated with his name and power, and you might even start to wonder whether or not he'll even truly be in the game at all. Of course, You fight a golden reflection of the man in the Erdtree Sanctuary, but that's a mere imitation of the real thing, because the real thing is significantly, substantially more vicious and epic. As with several other excellent bosses on this list, there's a terrifying transition as Godfrey sheds the body of his beast advisor, Serosh, from his back, embracing his true identity as Hoarah, chieftain of the Badlands, adopting a different fighting style and stance entirely, one with a focus on brutal hand-to-hand combat, complemented with kicks, slaps and throws, including brutal powerbombs, complete with him tearing open your character's chest if it's a killing blow. Absolutely awesome fight mechanically, and seriously, the second phase is one of the most terrifying in all of Soulsborne. He's so damn aggressive with long weird wind-ups to his attacks, and this is one of the most difficult fights when it comes to trying to find the time to squeeze in a heal, because he's always right on you with the next savage attack. Godfrey is the single sickest boss and character in Elden Ring, and even though your time with him is very brief, the entire climactic encounter with him is pretty much Elden Ring at its glorious golden best, and that's really saying something. Well, this is it folks. Position number 1, my all-time favourite Soulsborne boss. Someone even better than legends like Artorias, Ludwig and Godfrey. Who could it be? Well, I guess this is the part where I'm supposed to do that thing of showing a shitty boss instead as a joke, and then showing my actual pick. But I'm not going to do that, because that's kind of lame. My pick for all-time greatest Soulsborne boss is Slave Knight Gale, fought at the end of the Ring City DLC. The encounter takes place in the largest arena in the Dark Souls series. It features not one, but two of the game's best cutscenes, and it's all accompanied by such an overwhelming feeling of desolation and devastation. I've already spoken about the apocalyptic feel in Dark Souls 3, and those end-of-the-world elements coming through in many places and bosses, but none more so than when fighting Gale. Here, at some lost point in time, the world has completely fallen to ruin, having been reduced to ash, dust and never-ending storms, and what better arena to do battle with the fallen Slave Knight than this? I've spoken about bosses whose demeanours and even levels of sentience and intelligence take a dramatic shift partway through the fight, and the same thing happens in the Gale fight to an extent. He begins the battle by moving and attacking in a nearly animalistic manner, running on all fours like some maddened beast with wild, wide-arcing swings and combos from his broken greatsword, a blade ruined after untold centuries of searching for fragments of the Dark Soul for his lady's painting. It's a challenging phase, but at the same time, everything is very clear, fair and comprehensible, and you've also got an entire arena to make use of if you want. After losing about 35 to 40% of his HP though, Gale begins to bleed, and this is a very special type of blood. Here, the moving on all fours and bestial roars and combos comes to an end, because now Gale musters up every ounce of power contained within his ruined soul to deliver a thunderous onslaught of fire, lightning, miracles and everything else. Now, anytime an attack is delivered, it's immediately followed by an elemental miasma from Gale's skull-adorned cape, enhancing the impact, ferociousness and desperation every time he strikes out. Ladies and gentlemen, in my humble opinion, Soulsborne doesn't get any better than Slave Knight Gale. It's the perfect fight. It has everything I love in a boss fight, with none of the bullshit. Gale is not the most difficult boss here though, and in fact, I'm not even sure I'd put him in the list of top 20 most difficult bosses, but that's okay. In fact, it's more than okay, because if you compare Gale to much more challenging bosses like Malenia, Malekith or even Ishin's Sword Saint, I'm choosing Gale every fucking time. I'm not trying to detract from those three bosses when I say that, but rather what I'm trying to emphasise is that this encounter is tuned to near perfection, and thus, out of 162 Soulsborne bosses, the masterfully tragic foe that is Slave Knight Gale is at the top of my list.
Well folks, there you have it. There's my list. I'd like to say it was a ton of fun putting it all together, but it wasn't. In fact, The whole experience was fucking brutal, but to be honest, I wouldn't have done anything any different, because it's all done and finished now and out there, and here you are watching the conclusion. And by the way, congratulations for making it this far, and I hope you'll accept a massive thank you from me for watching my stuff. Let me give a final thank you to my kind patrons for their support, and on that note, cheers for watching and cheerio.